All right, so this is episode 3 of Dead Bodies and Domestic Advice. This episode is specifically on the evolution of the funeral industry, and I have two new guests with me today. So, Brooke, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, my name is Brooke. I am a history major.
Yeah, and then Elio.
Hi, I'm Elio, and I'm in History Club.
Do either of you know a whole lot about death in the 19th century in New England? Okay, well, we're going to get into it. And as always, my guests are welcome to ask questions if they want to. We're not actually going to start with death for this episode, but I'm going to take it back. My thesis for this whole project has been that wives use their roles, responsibilities in order to give them access to dead bodies. So I want to talk a little bit about what wives were doing in the mid-19th century and how the concepts of their roles were changing. So in prior episodes, I've talked a lot about how women have never really left the domestic, just the definitions and the bounds of the domestic have changed. And that was certainly true in the mid-19th century. William Alcott, who was a relative of Louisa May Alcott, wrote a manual in 1841 called The Young Wife or Duties of Women in the Relationship, which said that wives should be unperceived but always operative, as opposed to research that was done by scholars like Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who found that wives in early New England were certainly still subordinate. They've never not been subordinate, but were taking on roles such as deputy husband, heroine, mistress, et cetera, et cetera. Like they had more power within their position. And part of the reason for the loss of this the loss of this power is capitalism, essentially, that the workforce was changing and work was leaving the home. So what wives were doing, which was housework, was not being conceived as labor anymore because they weren't making money for it. So these domestic manuals wanted wives more contained in the home. However, it didn't really separate them from the duties that they would have prior that connected them to dead bodies. In fact, what wives were expected to do connected them further to dead bodies. So still, it was expected that wives would take care of their sick relatives, husbands, children, sick people in their neighborhoods and their families as a part of good Christian charity. Wives were reading these manuals that had recipes for like food if you were sick, so things that wouldn't upset your stomach or wouldn't make you feel too heavy for someone that's stuck in bed, or recipes for specific medicine, or even in some cases how to reset bones or do tiny things like that. If you couldn't immediately get to the physician. They also started to include a lot about sanitation. And so this will be my first question for you two, is that have either of you heard of miasma theory? If you have, what is it?
So I took Professor Henry's History of Death and Dying class. And so from that, I kind of know that miasma theory is when they thought that disease was spread through bad smell, basically.
Yeah, so bad air would make you sick. So wives were getting these books on sanitation. They would either be books or entire chapters, or at the very least a paragraph or a section within a domestic advice manual or cookbook. Sanitation was a big thing. And a lot of them would contain information about ventilation. Like good air would make you feel good. So this is going to lend itself to dealing with dead bodies and sort of like the bad air and concepts about dead bodies being contagion that we'll get into in a little bit. But the first thing I want to address to set our stage besides the duties for wives is the Civil War. So I want to be transparent in saying that our last episode dropped off with or ended with Martha Ballard's diary in 1812. And then there's a long stretch of time where things are pretty quiet. The funeral industry wasn't a completely professional industry at that point. The National Funeral Director Association wouldn't be established until 1882. So this was still an evolving industry, as we'll get into. And that's not entirely uncommon for things to have been like quiet. In my other research with cowboys and the Western frontier, Anglos were in Texas in 1821, but really the Wild West didn't start until after the Civil War. Well, it's sort of the same thing with dead bodies in the funeral industry. So in the Civil War, things changed a lot in terms of how Americans culturally conceived of death. Um, the biggest thing was that they had to grapple with this idea of the good death and what does it mean. So that'll be my second question for you. And Brooke took death, so should know this, but what is the good death? It's okay if you don't remember. Professor Henry isn't here.
Yeah, it has been a few years since I read the book, probably about 2.5 years. I read it in 2020. So from what I can remember, it's trying to align with whatever like religious principles you follow, trying to do what you can.
Yes. So the good death is this concept that the moment of death like super determines where you're going to go in the afterlife. And so there was an expectation that people would be by the bedside to catch like your last confessions and to make sure that you passed in a good religious way. For Americans and people in Europe, that tended to be a good Christian way. So making sure that you absolved any sins, you made sure everything was taken care of with your soul, and you died in like an honorable way. Well, in the Civil War, you can see how that might be an issue because you're on the battlefield, and so like one bullet and like you're gone. There's no like rites that you can do. You can't do any sort of like last Eucharist or anything like that. You're just gone. So what do you do when this is a war that is on a massive scale, the biggest war that the United States has ever fought? Like, how do you deal with that sudden passing that seriously challenges the idea of the good death? The answer that Americans came up with, there were many. People tried to write down people's last moments, write letters and keep them just in case that they passed so that they would have these last words to send home. Soldiers would try to record each other's last words. And some Americans turned to spiritualism, like seances and stuff, to try and reach in the beyonds. That wasn't like an entirely huge thing, but this idea that the dead are still with us became a lot more prevalent. Or if you didn't want to do any of those, but you wanted to have some sort of real ritualistic ceremony passing on for the person who's already dead, then what you could do was embalm their body. Embalming is like a super common practice. If you've ever been to a wake and you've seen someone who was dead, their body hasn't been embalmed. So filled with fluids, that way it will not decompose. And so everyone gets a chance to look at their loved ones one last time. A lot of people choose to do this today because, as a country, we're so big and so many people are spread out that if you have family coming from a long way, you don't want grandma to like rot before the funeral or anything like that. So that's why people use embalming today. In the Civil War, in this period, it was super sketchy, essentially. The practices were scientifically sound, but like people hadn't encountered this before and were very nervous. But at the same time, they're like, I want to say goodbye to my loved one last time. I want to make sure that they pass on well. And so soldiers were embalmed en masse for the first time. Embalmers followed the armies around, both the Confederate and the Union, in order to try and pick up corpses and embalm them. Of course, this was something you had to pay for. So families would have to send someone to get the body and have the embalming done, or send money and have the body sent back home on a train, which would become an issue later. So who actually got to be embalmed could vary. Some people would do it for very cheap, but also if you wanted sort of like the deluxe package, you would have to have more money. And so in that way, it was sort of a class difference. But embalming, just on the scale of the Civil War, and then following the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he was embalmed so that his body could be viewed. And that was the first president who had that procedure done to his corpse. And so people were beginning to trust it more. And that's where we start to get into the funeral industry as an actual thing, as something that was supremely profitable as opposed to maybe one individual in town that knows how to do it, who has other subsequent businesses because it's not that big of a moneymaker, or an undertaker who takes care of bodies and doesn't embalm them, but would also have other businesses, primarily a cabinet making business, because cabinets and coffins are pretty similar. So this was the first time that people were becoming like, this was your occupation and is what you did. So not only did embalming become super popular, but funeral practices in general changed. Undertakers, embalmers, and then funeral directors who provided a variety of services made funerals into both more show of class and something that was more consumer. So they would offer, in some cases, professional mourners, so people to actually attend the funeral and be bereaved, whether or not they knew the person. They also offered carriages and hearses, mourning attire, decorations, and funeral homes were a place to house the bodies. This is an age of urbanization. So as you know, industrial revolution, all of that good stuff, cities are becoming much more clogged. And this is before public health was really a thing. Like this is the beginning years of public health. So there wasn't a super easy way to keep people from getting sick in these congested conditions. I mean, some people just straight up didn't know that they could make other people sick. So there have been multiple cholera outbreaks in the United States in the 19th century from people who didn't realize that like throwing diapers in the well would make you sick if you drank like gross water. And so there was a lot of things that people had to contend with. And keeping a body in such close quarters didn't exactly work. In a house, you might be able to put it in a spare room or even in a barn if you had the space, but in an apartment, there's not a whole lot of area for a corpse. And also, corpses were starting to be seen more as contagion than anything else. So they were full of disease and they would make you sick, which I will get into in a minute. But that also led funeral homes and directors to become seriously invested in flowers. So that is really where we get like this tradition of flowers from. I mean, like they're a nice, sweet, pretty thing to give people, but also they make funeral homes seem less dreary, which is good for your business. You want people to come in. And two, they cover up any smells. So though we are embalming, you know, things are still stinky. The fluids don't smell that great. Embalming only lasts so long, like that sort of thing. So, and bodies, you know, when someone dies, things loosen, things happen. It can be a stinky process. So really funerals were becoming this consumer thing. But it was also becoming a big concern from governments and citizens alike, especially with these bodies and making other people sick. From 1857 to 1860, there were a number of conferences that were held by public health and municipal officials. So these people weren't like I said, public health wasn't super big, but these were people who were meeting in Baltimore and Philadelphia and on the East Coast and trying to figure out like, what do we do? And what they identified as a big issue is what are we going to do with these dead bodies? But there wasn't any like super clear answer until government started developing state boards of health. So state boards of health eventually transformed into state departments of health, which you're probably more familiar with, which regulated what could be done with dead bodies. And there's a plethora of things that they regulated. So for instance, only funeral directors or undertakers or certain licensed professionals could inter bodies, so bury bodies. If you tried to bury someone by yourself, you could be pretty heavily fined. The same thing for reporting deaths. So marriage death certificates were becoming more common. That had to be done by an attending physician or an undertaker or funeral director. So if someone died and you didn't tell anyone, you could get in trouble. Still the same situation today, but that's where it started. And there was also like, what do we actually do with these bodies? And what do we do about funerals? So state boards of health were extremely concerned about contagion from corpses. And the Vermont State Board of Health, or the Vermont legislature and the State Board of Health published this in one of their reports, passed a law, which was pretty common in terms of like laws that other states passed on what to do with bodies that died from contagion. So this quote from section 4686 of Chapter 193 of the Laws of Vermont reads, the bodies of persons who died of smallpox, Asiatic cholera, typhus fever, or yellow fever shall be wrapped in a sheet saturated in a solution of ½ pound of chloride of zinc in a gallon of water, or a solution of bichloride mercury of not less than 2% strength, enclosed in a proper coffin or box and buried immediately with as little publicity as possible. Such bodies shall not be put into a hearse or public vehicle or moved from town to town or brought into the state. Not only were bodies supposed to be treated in this very, very specific way, but only licensed people could do this. And the other thing is that if you had died of something that was contagious, such as typhus, you weren't allowed a public funeral. And if you were, of course, you would be holding your own funeral, but if your family or friends were caught holding a public funeral, they could be severely fined. And this happened quite a lot in the State Board of Health and State Department of Health records that I've read of people going out of town for a funeral and coming back sick with whatever the person died of, or holding a funeral in town and people become sick. And so it's not all that different from a situation that we've seen over the past 2 years, right? With people being like, don't go out in public, don't do this public thing. And people being like, well, it's my right to. And it just spread sickness. So there was a reason for this. And people were actually really concerned. There was a 1920 court case in the state of Washington, so outside of our bounds of New England, but still relevant, where neighbors sued a business within their neighborhood because it was a funeral home. And they sued them for practicing because they said that they were experiencing emotional distress. One of the claims was that they were terrified that the bodies were going to make them sick. So the same rhetoric that we've seen. And also they were really concerned about the distress it was having upon their wives, who had to stay home all day and who, if they had to see dead bodies, were going to like have a fit of hysteria and like weren't going to be able to deal with it. So my sort of last follow-up question before I sort of transition us to our next episode, and any questions that you have, feel free to jump in. But in the situation where state boards of health and state legislatures were creating such laws that made it so only certain people could handle bodies, how do you think that went for the funeral industry itself? I'm hoping it's me.
I would assume that it had a bit of a negative impact on their business because they're feeling all this pressure to like make sure they're doing things properly. And I'm sure like if they messed up and accidentally broke a law, that wouldn't be great for their business either.
Yeah, I think that that's true. That businesses tend to like to have as least regulation as possible, or a lot of businesses, as we've seen. But it also created this situation in which only funeral directors were able to handle bodies. And I'm going to admit a gap in my research here, which I go into depth more in my capstone and in my website, which is that I can only imagine that having these very, very prescribed ways to deal with bodies did seriously impact people's cultural practices, especially for non-Christians and non-white individuals. However, I simply just don't have evidence of that. And that's a major gap in my research and something I hope to close. But the last thing that I want to say is that even though all of these things were happening and these were laws being passed by men and these were like male funeral directors lobbying on either the behalf of bills or on the opposing side of bills, this sort of masculine rewrite of the history where funeral directors, their trade journals were like, yeah, it was men who started this industry and women who wrote in were seen as like peculiars. It did not work in terms of getting rid of women. So I'll close this episode by saying that all of the states in New England passed embalming examination boards, called different things in different states, between 1899, New Hampshire being the first, and 1908, Rhode Island being the last. And it was not the case that women were not passing these board exams. I was only able to find the examination results and licensure results for the state of Maine, but between the years of 1903 to 1919, 15 women passed Maine's examination, embalming examination. 2 women passed twice, and a good majority of them were married to male undertakers. So women were not out of the industry, and that is the conversation that we will have on the next podcast. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your participation, and I will see you on the next episode.